Hey, everybody, welcome back to Monday, the best night of the week. That's because it's time for this week's episode of RfRx, your prescription for coping. I'm Kara, I'll be your host, and I have with me our favorite returning co host, Rob Palmer. Rob, how are you doing? And did you survive the snowpocalypse? Clearly you did, but how was it for you?
Well, I don't know if you heard that, but as we were
No,
talking,
I didn't.
okay, as we were talking in the pre-show, the YouTube went live and probably it cut the beginning of you off again, and it just started to blab, even though I thought I had muted it.
Oh
So,
no.
yes, I just closed YouTube, so I don't have to deal with it. So, yes, I'm just fine. I survived. We got an amazing amount of snow, probably more than we've had in 6 or 7 inches. Yeah, tell me there's no climate change. Yeah, this is like was really weird, and I've been a little worried about the temperatures. It's been like dangerous levels if the power goes out for a lengthy period of time, kind of
Yeah.
screwed. So I'm not
Yes.
happy. How is it near you?
It's been interesting. I'm joining from Texas, and we got, what would be considered a blizzard probably by our standards, which was a few inches of ice and snow. But of course, they did close the state for inclement weather for a few days, but we're back open again. Um, and things are thawing now. It was in the 50s earlier today, so
Oh, 50s. It's so cold.
I mean, it's cold for us,
Single
but
digits here, single digits. Very scary.
yeah, I am feeling
Fahrenheit,
for everybody
Fahrenheit, by the way, people. Yes.
that's stuck in that. But glad you made it. And glad everybody made it here tonight to join us. Can't wait to chat with our super cool guest this evening. So, this is going to be a lot of fun. And for anybody who's new here, Recovering from Religion offers hope, healing, and support to those struggling with issues of doubt and non belief. And RFRX is our weekly live stream show where we host guests who discuss topics that are relevant to folks in the RFR community. And today we're going to be talking about thinking scientifically about science and religion with Dr. Aaron Adair. And as a reminder to everyone, Recovering from Religion is a nonprofit organization, and our shows are designed to generate conversation and engage our powers of reason. And all of our guest speakers are presenting their own views. People of any political or religious affiliation are welcome to join the show, and this is a safe space for members of the LGBTQ plus community. So we ask that everyone please keep your comments civil. If you disagree with someone in the chat, do so respectfully, and please respect the speaker, the hosts, the other guests, and yourself. And if you have any questions for our guest, feel free to drop those in the chat and we'll ask as many as we have time for at the end of the program. So, with that, Rob, would you care to do the honors of introducing our guest?
Absolutely. Tonight, our guest is from his own website, the man, the myth, the scientist, Dr. Aaron Adair, who earned a PhD in physics from Ohio State University, is a research affiliate at MIT, and a professional data scientist. He focuses on education research, the history of science, popular culture, and biblical studies, an interesting mix. Aaron applies data analysis and machine learning to education research, history, and religious folklore studies with publications in both Old and New Testament studies, the history of science, and psychometrics. Don't know what that is. He's the author of two books, The Star of Bethlehem, A Skeptical View, and the second he's a co-author of Aliens and Religion, Where Two Worlds Collide. And coming soon, The Exodus, a critical examination of the Moses story, and also Godzilla, a nuclear humanism. That's a fascinating title. We have to ask about that. Aaron is also an area chair at the Southwestern Popular and American Culture Association and a member of the Society of Biblical Literature and lives with his wife, Janice, in the greater Boston area. Welcome to RFRX.
Thank you for having me here. One correction, my university is the Ohio State University. It's officially the definite article.
So that's interesting because I looked in Wikipedia and it didn't say the, so I thought you had a typo. So what's with that?
I believe it actually went to a lawsuit to make that part of the official title. So you don't want to confuse that with any other Ohio States. It's the Ohio State.
This is what my sister is in Oklahoma, and there's Oklahoma University and the University of Oklahoma, which is equally as confusing.
Very confusing.
Oh, yes.
I love it. Well, we're glad that you're joining us on the RFRX podcast from wherever you are. And cannot wait to hear more about your topic. And also, I just have to start with a question. I asked you when you logged in if that was your real background behind you with all those books because I really really love books. Um, and I also bought yours and started reading it before this, the Aliens and Religion one. So we'll have to talk about that later. But can you tell us what your favorite book is that's on one of the shelves behind you currently?
That is so hard. Oh my goodness. I mean, if I choose one of my own books, that's just nothing but egotism, so I'm definitely not doing such a thing. Uh, hmm. So I'm quickly looking back there, and it reminds me of some of the really awesome anthology collections of atheist or humanist work put together by John Loftus. I have several of his volumes together. I'm a
Mm.
contributor to one of those, but in particular, the one I'm looking behind me isn't one of them. So yeah, the various anthologies that Loftus has put together have been a go-to resource for me in the past.
Excellent. Okay, thanks for sharing. Adding to my Goodreads reading list now. Okay, and now that I've quizzed you enough, I think, I believe you have a presentation to share with us. Do you wanna hop into that?
Yes, let me go and do the clicky stuff to bring that up. And in theory, slides.
And so,
Yes,
so
we
people
can
know
begin.
this is a first. This is the first group of people seeing this presentation, and Aaron welcomes feedback.
Absolutely. This has been in the back of my head for a while that I had started a book project related to this, but it's been on the back burner for a whole bunch of other things that have been taking up my bandwidth. But this has been an excellent excuse to come back, think about that, and present some of the reasons that we might want to be even more scientific in how we think about science, religion, how the two mix together. Can they mix together? What's going to happen? So let's talk a little bit about what I'm going to go through. So, you've probably heard of terms like methodological versus metaphysical naturalism. You might have heard about the Galileo affair when it comes to science versus religion. All the different ways that religious people try to make sense of their texts in light of the science that we know. Well, want to hit those sorts of things and maybe hit some details that you haven't hit before. The stuff I'll tell you about Galileo will probably be new to you. And in general, what can science say or not say about the supernatural? And if we're going to be a bunch of disbelievers, what spirituality do we find in a scientific process that tries to disbelieve rather than believe things? So let's start with a little bit of background here and maybe a little bit of confrontation, a view many may have that science and religion, they're always at war with each other. Science says one thing, religion says another thing. They're in total contradiction and it's fight to the death. That has been known as the conflict hypothesis or the conflict thesis. And while you will find various older historians trying to argue for that, for the most part, it is dismissed by modern historians of science. Not that there's never been conflict between the two, but to say that this is natural, that they are inherently in conflict with each other, is not supported. And so, rightly, things like the the National Center for Science Education will say there's no necessary conflict between the two. The history shows plenty of examples where there isn't a conflict between the two. This has been both good in correcting the historical record and also when we are trying to argue in the classroom and things like that. Hey, if we are teaching science, we don't have to be teaching atheism. We don't have to be confrontational when it comes to religion if we're going to be teaching controversial things like evolution. And of course, it's only controversial because of the religious implications. Now, it's also going to be a bit interesting when we talk about science and religion because in many ways, both of these are modern phenomena. There have been religious beliefs for thousands and thousands of years, but the idea that religion is this collection of propositional knowledge about the supernatural, that's a relatively recent phenomena that is ultimately post Reformation and very Western in its orientation. Religion itself doesn't even have a good definition. Uh, Literally, religious scholars will tell you they don't know what they study, as in they don't have a solid definition that everyone agrees to. So there is, in general, this seeing that what we call religion nowadays is many ways historically contingent and very Western and Protestant focused. So if we're going to talk about science and religion with those categories, we're being very small in the subset of things we are looking at. Nonetheless, if we're looking at the various ways that science or religious beliefs can come into contact, they don't necessarily need to be fighting. This is often said, or you might even say they have no interaction at all. The idea of non-overlapping magisteria, or NOMA, was introduced, at least the nomenclature was introduced by the great late biologist Stephen Jay Gould in one of his books from 1997. And the whole idea is, well, the two talk about completely separate things, they never interact, so there's no problem. Historically, though, that's definitely not true. The two clearly interact, they clearly say things that both touch on each other. So what Gould was doing was more saying what we should be doing rather than something about the history of religion and science. On the other hand, Ian Barber is a major figure in the study of science and religion, talks about conflict, talks about there being independence between the two, but also talks about the possibilities of dialogue and integration between science and religion. They can be talking about the same thing and adding to each other. Fundamentally, things like natural theology kind of depend on this to be the case, using the natural world to argue about the existence of God or the nature of God. That would be in direct contradiction to Noma. So these ideas exist out there, and I want to say it is definitely false to say that science and religion necessarily conflict. But the conflicts happen. Why do they happen? And the ways to avoid that. Well, how well is it going to actually work out? So let's talk about especially this main way of trying to avoid the conflict, describing what is nature, naturalism, and the method that goes along with naturalism. Often you will hear about this distinction between methodological and metaphysical naturalism. And one is about process, one is about the nature of things. And the idea is under methodological naturalism, there are no metaphysical commitments. You can be an atheist, you can be a Buddhist, you can be a Christian, and your results will be correct no matter what your metaphysics are. The whole point of science is that it is describing the natural world and can only point to natural entities to explain those things. Appeals to the supernatural are not allowed even if the supernatural exists. If you point to the supernatural, you are going outside the bounds of science, no matter what your metaphysics is. On the other hand, metaphysical naturalism, that says explicitly only nature exists, and which is another way of saying that there are no supernatural entities. Now, this also comes to a point of definitions. What's the difference between natural and supernatural? How do you actually define them? And the best definition I have found for supernatural is that there exists efficacious, disembodied minds. This captures the idea of what gods, demons, angels, ghosts are, things that aren't composed of matter, that have some sort of mental quality and can at least bump things around. That's the most basic thing of what we mean by some sort of supernatural agent doing things in the world. On naturalism, those things don't exist. And of course, if metaphysical naturalism is true, well, methodological naturalism kind of falls out automatically. There aren't any supernatural agents to point to for explanations. So you can see that if you are a metaphysical naturalist, you're effectively saying that you're an atheist and you're going to do science for things. But the idea is under methodological naturalism, we can be more neutral about these sorts of claims. It has the fundamental premise then that the supernatural just can't really be tested. Is this true? Or is this being prescriptive for science rather than descriptive? Because the idea that you can or cannot test God, that can you actually go and do experiments on the supernatural? We see examples of that throughout history. We can come up with examples of what we can do. It's kind of a weird thing to say that they can't be done when we've done them. So fundamentally, if a supernatural worldview has some sort of predictions of things that we could see in the observable world, those things can be examined. We can go and see if those claims about the world are true or not. We can make observations. For example, suppose we have the belief that there exists a God that wants everything to be purple. We can go and test that hypothesis and see, are there any non-purple things in the observable world? And if we find any non-purple things, that would be evidence against that hypothesis. This is observation, testing, coming to conclusions. Sounds like the scientific method to me. To say that somehow this is no longer science seems to just be stopping it based on prejudice rather than on any actual grounding. Now, the idea that there's a God out there that wants everything to be purple might sound a little bit silly, but it's kind of similar in format to say, what about a God that answers prayers? a universe where there is a God that answers prayers should look different than one that doesn't have such a being. If there's an observational difference between those two, we could potentially go and collect data and see which kind of universe we're in. Also, we've been testing psychics for decades, if not centuries. I'm pretty sure we can say that James Randi was able to show that at least some psychics didn't have the powers that they claimed to. Uh, we have, things like with Zener cards to see if people can guess what's on the other side better than chance. And while the best evidence I have found for psychic powers comes from the movie Ghostbusters, I'm being a little facetious when I say that, but fundamentally, the idea that you could go and do some sort of test, collect data, do statistical significance testing to see if the phenomenon exists, we can do that. We do that. The only issue is that when we go and test psychics and we're critical about it, it tends not to come out well for the supernaturalist claims. There's only one way a supernatural claim could not actually be tested by science, and that is if it doesn't predict anything. Whether the entity exists or does not exist gives the exact same observations. Basically, if you can't tell the difference between if the hypothesis is true or false, that's the only way you couldn't go and test it. But now you're just basically saying the only way the supernatural can be consistent with science is if it doesn't do absolutely anything. Now you're making some metaphysical claims, aren't you? This methodological naturalism thing doesn't seem to be all that accurate with how we do science now. And historically, it doesn't really work well either. Because if you go to the 17th, 18th, 19th century, you find scientists who want to go and test miracles to figure out what denomination of Christianity is actually correct. You can find examples of this sort of thinking even in ancient Christianity, where they say they're the ones doing real miracles and the pagans are either faking it or using demons. So while there wasn't the same kind of science existing in, say, the 2nd century AD, when we did have the scientific revolution, you had scientists saying, we want to go investigate miracles claims and figure out who actually has the real deal, because they might be telling us something true and new about God. The problem is, when they went out and did that, is they couldn't validate any miracles. So the problem isn't that science can't do that, is that when it went out, it didn't succeed. So you had people like Robert Boyle, one of the foundational figures in chemistry in the Royal Society. He believed that the time of miracles was over, that basically that only existed in the days of Jesus and the earliest church, and not in his time. Even Shakespeare, earlier than that, was already putting in his place the idea that miracles, that's something of the past, and now our philosophers are going and explaining the supernatural by actual real natural causes. Why? Because apparently in Shakespeare's day, they're like, yeah, this miracle stuff doesn't really seem to happen, or at least we can't validate it. Even today, there are efforts to try to validate miracles, but they should be considered unconvincing. On the screen here, I have the image of this 2-volume work by Craig Keener about miracles, where he tried to go and collect as many firsthand accounts of miracles happening in modern times, and how many of those miracles in this giant 1,000-ish page collection of work was he able to go through and carefully validate by multiple sources? 0. And yet this giant doorstop of work is supposed to somehow show that miracles exist now, therefore we can trust the miracle claims in the New Testament. Quite literally, among the things in there are weather miracles, and here's how things were proven to show that the miracle happened. At some village in Africa, a shaman there said that there was going to be rain in a village that hadn't been rained on in quite a while, and 3 days later, in that village, it rained. How do we know this? The person telling the story 40 years later said so. Did Keener go and check anything true about this? Did he check weather reports? Nothing that he said. Is it just common that these sorts of rainstorms happen? Did he compare that against any sort of background rate that these things happen? Did he check the background rate? Did that shaman like this just make these sorts of predictions? And we're just picking the one example. Did he do any of that? No. Did he do anything to actually critically examine or try to disprove any of those claims? When I went through that large set of tomes, no. And that's a pretty damning thing if here's the work that's going to show that miracles happen and it doesn't do the work of validating any. So unfortunately, many a claim, but not the validation when we try and look for it. Nonetheless, this is us trying to test these things and see if they're real. Just because we come out with a negative result, that doesn't mean we didn't do science. It's we got a scientific result and we didn't like it. And fundamentally, I think this is where a lot of methodological naturalism comes from. because this idea that this is the way science is supposed to be done is a rather modern view that comes out of Christian theology. The earliest coinage of the term methodological naturalism comes from a Christian evangelical philosopher in the 1980s at Wheaton College, Paul de Vries. He coins the term, but an earlier version of this idea does seem to exist with another philosopher by the name of Edgar Brighton. He was a philosopher at Boston University, and he came from a liberal Protestant background. So we have to wait until well into the 20th century to even see this kind of view being articulated in a sort of clear way. If you go back in time, you can definitely see that this was not the normal way people thought about the natural world or the natural sciences. You can see throughout a lot of church history the hatred of Epicurean physics, which by that I mean atomism, the existence of atoms being random things bouncing around. Early Christians hated that view. And with it, they hated the idea that there's the multiplicity of worlds. In other words, that there are other planets. That was declared a heresy at least since St. Augustine, along with multiple popes. And it was the reason that the Giordano Bruno was put to death, burning at the stake in 1600, because among the things he claimed was the multiplicity of worlds and people on them. He basically said, hey, I think aliens exist. Burn. Does that sound like methodological naturalism to you guys? The church coming in and saying, nope, there won't be that? The Condemnation of 1277, this was basically a reaction to Aristotelian philosophy and physics that was becoming big in the university system at this time, and basically saying, here's a bunch of views that the Aristotelians are saying, and they do not comport to church teaching, therefore they are false. Things like the infinity of the world, that it's always existed, or that a vacuum is impossible. These things were condemned as heresies, that they go against proper Christian beliefs. So again, something quite supernatural coming in and saying, this is how the natural world has to be treated. John Calvin saying that, hey, the reason we can even have dry land is itself supernatural. Under Aristotelian physics, everything should be covered with water. So the fact that we're on dry land right now is a miracle. The natural world should not allow the land we stand on to even exist. If God stopped holding back the waters, we'd all be flooded. Martin Luther also said that, hey, life can't be generated by the elements. Like the sun shining on things can only warm things. It can't generate things. Only God can do that. And my favorite example, the late geocentrist astronomer Giovanni Battista Riccioli wrote this massive tome in response to people like Kepler and Galileo. And to explain his geocentric view and the motions of the planets, he has to argue that the planets move because they are being pushed by angels, which was itself a relatively common view throughout the medieval period. Does that sound like methodological naturalism? Again, just example after example after example, where clearly that was not the demarcation in these times. So why do we have to wait until the 20th century until some philosopher said, no, that clearly science should never be dealing with the supernatural? And the fact that it comes about in the 20th century and in the particular years it comes about is interesting. I mentioned Brightman is coming out with his stuff in the 1930s. This is not too long after the Scopes monkey trial in the mid-1920s. And a lot of his essay, you can see, is in reaction to realizations of what Darwinian evolution was implying about the world. So he's basically saying what is true about God can't contradict the sciences, but also the science can't say what God is or isn't ultimately. We have to keep these two domains separate to some degree. There are things that are true about God that science can't discover, and vice versa. Now, interestingly, though, for him to be consistent with all these things that he sees, he also has to say that God is not infinite. He's not all powerful. And he does that to explain why there does seem to be teleology in the world. There seems to be some goal-directedness in the world. He also sees all sorts of examples of dysteleology, basically all the waste, all the terrible things that we see, for example, in the evolutionary process. So strangely enough, his view is closer to the 2nd century pagan Dr. Galen, who also argued that there was some sort of finite creator that created the natural world, but wasn't all powerful because of, well, you could see all the examples of things not going right in the natural world. On the other hand, De Vries was an evangelical Christian, definitely believes the Bible. So he has to come along with some sort of way that can protect both his evangelical stance, but also make sure that we're not just ignoring the science. So in his essay where he introduces the term methodological naturalism, he both poo-poos Henry Morris, the young earth creationist, and Carl Sagan for being too secular in his science. Fundamentally, he is saying that there is a proper role for the natural sciences, and that is a prescriptivist view, not descriptive. And ultimately saying that there are things that science can't know, it's incomplete, and this is where theology comes in and adds things that science is not able to discover. So he's arguing this based on Christian philosophy and theology, rather than this being like the better epistemology. This does not look like how science was being argued about beforehand, and this is a backtracking way of defending the belief. And again, note De Vries is writing in the 1980s, specifically 1983, and this is just a year after a Supreme Court case, again, about evolution versus creationism in the classrooms. And he's at Wheaton College, which had been a battleground for these sorts of arguments among evangelical Christians. How do they fit evolution into their beliefs about creation? The only way this is going to work then is that religion and science don't actually mix, and religion has something worth saying, that it actually has epistemic value. If both of those things aren't true, then methodological naturalism is kind of pointless. Really, what you can say is this: there are things that the Bible says about the natural world. You can look through there and it says all sorts of things. Either those claims are true and they match our science, or they're false, but they're not really false. And you can already see I'm being a little facetious with that, but to use a phrase invented by Al Franken, I'm kidding on the square. I'm being serious by joking. Let's talk about how we might try to save the various texts of religious traditions by treating them literally, but not literally. There are all sorts of ways that we can try to look at a text, say, hey, that sounds crazy, but then we try to rationalize what might be really happening that's actually consistent with our views of how the world actually works. This strategy is quite ancient. We find it among the Greeks and Romans, ways of taking their myths and folklore and trying to make them more scientific. For example, there were the myths about centaurs, these half man, half human creatures. Well, one of the explanations for this was some of the earliest people to start riding horses came in. The peasants had never seen horses and never seen people riding the horses. So they thought there's this new breed of creature that is a man on top and a horse on the bottom. It sounds a little bit silly, but that was one of their explanations. More recently, you have people trying to explain various biblical miracles. So, for example, the parting of the Red Sea, it's not the grand sort of thing that you saw in the movie by Cecil B. DeMille. No. What it was is that instead of it being the Red Sea, it was the Reed Sea, which was a swampy marsh, and then the wind blowing over just dried the swamp, so it was easy for the Israelites to escape running across the dried marshlands. And that's explaining what we see in Exodus 14 and 15. Does it actually fit the description? No, but I'm going to save that for later discussion.
Or in conjunction with what we talked about in the pre-show, the recent passing of Eric von Daniken of Chariots of the Gods. One of his things was aliens did it with a tractor beam. That's what made the Red Sea part.
Yes. There are books even specific to. It's called like the Bible and Flying Saucers. It came around the same time as Chariots of the Gods, also trying to explain the biblical miracles with aliens. Whatever it takes to make those stories somehow believable. We are trying to make it sound rational to us so we don't dismiss them anymore. There's other strategies from antiquity as well. One is called euhemerization, named after a man by the name of Euhemerus in the 3rd, 4th century BC, basically saying the gods were dudes and the stories about them got exaggerated, or that the dude themselves set a cult up to themselves and became deified in their own lifetimes, and that's where Zeus actually came from. These sorts of rationalizations have been around the past, the medieval period, modern times. We're very good at making them up, but boy, oh boy, do we have a hard time making us want to think that they're real. Let me give an example that maybe you haven't heard of, but is a bit interesting because it brings in our interesting debates about the nature of the solar system and our friend Galileo. As you guys might know, Galileo got into some trouble with the Catholic Church when he was arguing that the Earth went around the sun rather than vice versa. The story has become more complex once you get into the details. It is not so simple as just religion bad, science good. It's a much more complicated story, which I can't get into. But one of the points of argument was about interpreting the biblical text who has the authority to do that. And in particular, it looks like if you read some of the stories, it's pretty clear that the sun goes around the earth, because in the story of Joshua commanding the sun to stop, so that way the day could last longer, so Joshua could kill more enemies in battle, that sure sounds like the sun is going around the earth, and that is Joshua telling the sun to stop rather than the earth to stop spinning. How do we make this work on a heliocentric model if the Bible seems to be implying a geocentric model? Well, Galileo was a bit clever in a way, though he was also a bit inconsistent. At first, he talks about, hey, sometimes we can't treat things literally. The way that God describes things, he has to accommodate to his audience. But then he also switches to a completely literal interpretation. And in the physics of Galileo, he says, well, when Joshua told the sun to stop, he means sun, stop spinning. And his view was that because the sun spins, this actually imparts rotary motion to the other planets throughout the solar system. So telling the sun to stop spinning also makes the earth stop spinning and revolving. So what Joshua did is do the correct commandment on a heliocentric model. And we see this early on in one of his letters to his friend Castelli. He uses this sort of line of argument later with the Grand Duchess Katerina. But you might notice that there's a problem with this sort of argument. Our physics isn't the same as what Galileo said. If the sun stops spinning, that doesn't do jack or squat to the motions of the earth. So his entire argument to rationalize this, to make it literally work, doesn't literally work. Modern attempts to try to do similar things also fail. There have been a few scholars or scientists who try to say that Joshua 10 is actually talking about a solar eclipse. Read the text. No, it's clearly not. In fact, it even makes it impossible, because it says the sun and moon are basically on opposite sides of the sky being viewed by Joshua, and he's telling them both to stop. And if the sun and moon are in different parts of the sky, the moon cannot be covering the sun to create a solar eclipse. So it just does not work. How I wish this were the crazier things I have come across with people trying to rationalize the Bible. Perhaps a bit fun or headbanging, depending on your point of view, are some of the ways that people have tried to rationalize the story of Jesus and the miracles that he did. When Jesus was walking in water in the late 18th, early 19th century, one of the attempts was to say it was a dark and stormy night, and the disciples are being tossed around on their boat, and they didn't realize that they'd actually have been beached. And they thought they were out in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, and Jesus was walking along the beach shore. The disciples think, oh my goodness, the master, he's walking on water. They were just confused. Guys, nothing miraculous happened. The disciples were just dopes. Not exactly the kindest view. On the other hand, in this book I'm showing here, The Physics of Christianity by Frank Tipler, a physicist who had been a professor at Tulane University, he suggests that Jesus is able to walk on water because he's firing a beam of neutrinos under him, and he has this really advanced form of propulsion.
No. Was he
I wish I
serious?
were kidding. Oh, he loves his neutrinos. He even uses that to explain the resurrection body of Jesus. So one of the common ways to rationalize the story of how Jesus was seen to be walking around after he was killed was, oh, Jesus didn't actually die on the cross. He just passed out, and then he recuperated inside the tomb. And when they saw him again, they thought he came back from the dead. There's a lot of picking and choosing that has to happen for this to work from the text of the Gospels, and you have to add rationalizations on top of rationalizations. Tipler is a bit more consistent. Jesus' body turned into neutrinos, and that's why he could, for example, pass through walls and be seen by the disciples in rooms and just vanish all of a sudden, because he was just phasing in and out, because neutrinos can pass through walls and they can pass through the entire earth without even being disturbed.
Are they
Lawrence
sure
Krauss,
it wasn't I mean, neutrinos, I don't know about, but could it have been midichlorians? Because I mean, I saw that Star Wars movie, and he looks a lot like Jesus, I'm just saying.
in this house, we don't talk about midichlorians.
That's fair, I will accept that answer.
Nonetheless, as you can imagine, this book did not exactly change any physicists' minds about how things work. Lawrence Krauss wrote a review about this book, and he said, I would call it nonsense, but that would be insult to nonsense. So this has not been persuasive, to put it mildly. But like I say, it is an example of trying to make the story make sense when you know the supernatural doesn't make sense. And of course, if we go into my wheelhouse, there's this book you could go and buy 6 or 7 copies of. And all sorts of attempts for the last several centuries to try to explain the birth story of Jesus and this miraculous star that seems to hover around and guide wise men to a particular house in Bethlehem. There have been attempts to explain it as a comet, a supernova, a planet or planetary conjunction, ball lightning, aliens, you name it. Somebody has suggested it as a star of Bethlehem. Basically, if it glows, I was going to make a rhyme, but I don't think it'd be a good rhyme, so I'm going to drop that. Nonetheless, these attempts don't work. I go through details as to why they don't. If you actually care about what the text says, if you don't care about what the text says, well, congratulations, you're doing apologetics rather than actual scientific analysis. This stuff just doesn't work. How are we
So
going to try to make these stories
anything
make
there
sense?
that's in space, not counting the ball lightning, which by the way, I don't think is a real thing. I understand from skeptical evaluation, but the things that would be in space, as the Earth rotates under them, they wouldn't stay in one place to be over Bethlehem. Even as a young child into astronomy, I was probably 10 or so. I thought that was bullshit because how are they writing this? So they don't understand how the Earth and works in relation to things in space.
The ancient and medieval Christians knew that this star moved supernaturally. They are explicit about that. Because, yeah, it is really clear. Basic astronomy says this can't happen. And weirdly enough, if you go to the planetarium during Christmas time, most planetaria have a Star of Bethlehem presentation, but the workers there don't actually believe it. The Star of Bethlehem amongst planetariums has a special moniker. It's the SOB. And yes, they mean it that way. I worked as a planetarium operator, so I talked with them. They've done internal polling. I've talked to other folks, like the person who did the forward to my book, did a similar study and found out, yeah, most people who present these shows don't actually believe them. It just puts butts in seats and gives them an opportunity to teach them some basic science. But that's an annoyance for another presentation. So let's try to make these stories make some more sense, because the rationalization approach, it just makes nonsense of the stories. And it's also insulting to the authors that they don't even know what they're talking about, but we know better. It's really not kind to anyone. So religion has its own way of dealing with this. Religion has been saving religion for a long time. The fancy term that you can use for this is hermeneutics. The word itself comes from Hermes, the messenger god. And so it's basically, how do we get messages out of the text? How do we go about interpreting what the word of God is trying to say? And when you have a holy book and it seems to contradict science, either the science is wrong or the interpretation of the book is wrong. Notice the book itself won't be wrong. That's not on the table for this sort of approach. The basic philosophy is that there are two books that God has provided, nature and the Bible. And because God is the author for both of them, they can't actually contradict. Now, in the message that God provides in his book, he does have to account for the limitations of his audience, the things that they're ignorant about. You just can't tell them anything and everything and have them understand. I used to teach high school. I taught high school physics. Do you think I wrote down the Schrodinger equation and tried doing Hamiltonian operators in front of them? No, because they wouldn't understand that. It would not be a useful way of teaching. The idea is a similar strategy here. You instead try to teach them or communicate things that would fit within their understanding, and this is generally called accommodationism. You have ideas like this being talked about by Galileo, or more recently, the late particle physicist and later Anglican priest John Polkinghorne. That literally went from particle physics to preacher and believed that, yeah, science and religion compatible. One of the ways you can make them compatible is that you have to realize that the message can't be treated so woodenly and literally, that God has to accommodate the message to his audience. But they haven't really gone through, I think, and thought through what are the epistemic pitfalls for doing that. So the whole idea under accommodationism is that there is some lack of understanding, this lack of knowledge in your listener or your reader. So imagine you're the teacher. You know your class of students or the individual student doesn't know things, doesn't understand things, also probably believe things that aren't true. If you're a good teacher, what do? Well, one of the things is you probably provide that required knowledge. You give them knowledge so that way they now know more. Do you provide information to them that is misinforming? Sure. If you're a bad teacher, a good teacher might simplify things. we might say dumb things down, but if they give incorrect things that are false, but just happen to fit what the student believes, we would say that they are a bad teacher. They are reinforcing the things that are wrong just because it's easier for them to do that. In education theory, we have a way of talking about what a student can learn and what they can't learn, or what they can learn with help. So there's this idea of what is known as the zone of proximal development. The basic idea is this. At the core, you have the things that a student can learn without any additional aid. They don't need an instructor to come along. Then there is a zone where the learner can progress, they can generate new knowledge with guidance, with help. And then there are things that the learner cannot do even with help. If there is a 5-year-old, I probably can't teach them quantum mechanics in 1 year. I think that's beyond my ability as a teacher. It's beyond the ability for them to learn that. At least most 5-year-olds would not be capable of doing that. On the other hand, college students who have learned calculus probably have a better chance of learning quantum mechanics with help. So we have some understanding of how this is supposed to work, but how does it work with God, especially if we cannot understand God? If God especially is supposed to be so inscrutable that there is no way that we can understand his ways. Think of it like this. If God is completely beyond our ability to understand, what can you know about God without help? Nothing, right? If it's supposed to be literally unscrutable. Conversely, if there's nothing true that you know about God, how does then God communicate things with you on accommodationism where he will conform to your prior beliefs? It's now the case that even God can't teach you things about God because you have started off with a lack of knowledge, and on accommodationism, God won't correct that. He will stick with the original false information in your head. This really means that it's not possible to generate new knowledge. When it comes to texts as well, we also see throughout the history of all sorts of religions that have some sort of holy text, those messages can be reinterpreted with new knowledge. How the flood story of Noah was vastly reinterpreted once we discovered, hey, there are older versions of these sorts of flood stories. Our understanding of what the message was supposed to be changed, which means how do we know what the message is actually supposed to be if the message had to accommodate people thousands of years ago who didn't know things that we know? If the text can always be reinterpreted to now incorporate new knowledge, you can't generate knowledge from the text itself. Accommodationism makes knowledge impossible. That's a pretty terrible indictment. And it's not just about the natural world. It also bleeds into other things that are important to religious believers, including morality and mortality. If God must accommodate his message to the beliefs of an ancient audience, he won't fix mistaken beliefs. So, for example, is slavery wrong? People back in the day definitely thought it was right. And if you open up to Leviticus chapter 25, God gives you the instructions of how to buy and continue to possess and have as possessions for inheritance other human beings. It's straight up chattel slavery given the big thumbs up by the Almighty. We know better now. So what do we do with this text? We have to find some way to explain it away. And under accommodationism, I guess God had to accommodate moral evils. If God won't even correct such moral evils, how can we use it as a moral guidebook? Ooh. Now,
So
obviously, Christians have other. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I listen to these atheist call-in shows of which you often participate, and a lot of times theists call in and they try to bend it and say, "Well, it wasn't slavery; it was indentured servitude or something like that." You know,
Oh, yeah.
where's that kind of accommodation fit in?
So that I would put more under rationalization, because they are claiming the text doesn't say what you think it says. Under accommodation, it says what you think it says, but God had to massage the message so it could be understandable to the ancient audience. So I would say that the modern folks are coming in and they're trying to rationalize it because they know God can't endorse the most terrible evil possible. So it can't mean what it seems to mean. Under accommodationism, we'd say, well, it means what it is, but there's limitations of what God could instruct the Israelites. He could tell them absolutely no to sell shellfish, but okay to buy sex slaves. Yeah, it becomes ridiculous when you actually think about it. This will be the ongoing theme of this talk. It's terrible when you think about it. Uh, let's also add this to something else that I think is important to most religious believers. What happens when we die? The vast majority of people are going to tell you that if you're a good person, you go to heaven. If you're a bad person, you go to hell, or at the very least, you don't go to heaven. There is some sort of belief about life after this life, and you can go and find texts in the Bible to support that. However, if accommodation is true, is it the case that God is only communicating this to ancient people and that's just what they happen to believe, and God is not correcting that ancient belief? We don't know anymore, do we? We can't actually use the promise of an afterlife in the biblical text to actually show that there is an afterlife, because the God might have just trying to been accommodating that message to people who didn't know better. We've now lost the promise for immortality if we use this strategy. So, yeah, you can make the Bible consistent with science, but now you've lost everything that you might value from these religious claims. You've lost epistemology, you've lost morality, you've lost hope for an immortal future. That's quite the sacrifice, again, once you think about it. Now, I'm being pretty mean so far about the science religion situation. And it, at least in theory, could be the case that science could come in and save religion. Maybe science could actually come in and show something true about religion. And no, it's not going to be something quantum. Basically, once somebody throws around the word quantum to explain their religion, my brain almost completely turns off. I listen just long enough to regain consciousness and then point out, no, that's not what quantum mechanics says. No, don't tell me what Deepak Chopra says. No, that's not true. No, no, no. But quantum mysticism is another talk. Nonetheless, we could have a scientific religion, at least theoretically. What is science about? It's having a testable model that is consistent with all of our background knowledge and makes novel predictions. Which means if we had a scientifically based religion, it would go out, make predictions, and we, as good, faithful religionists doing science, would go and try to see if those predictions are false. We would try to actually falsify, we would try to disprove our beliefs. Fundamentally, this is the sort of strategy described by John Loftus in his Outsider Test for Faith. The problem is most people are defenders of their own internal faith rather than trying to show something objectively across things. So we should be going from the default. We can't tell if any of these religions are right. They could easily all be wrong. What could an outsider do to convince you that they are right or wrong? That's fundamentally what science is supposed to do, and science is in the business of going and trying to disprove claims, and if you fail to, then you have reason to be confident in those claims. That's what a scientific approach to religion could be, and there have been those kinds of things in the past. Earlier, I mentioned Galen. This doctor had scientific training, knew a whole lot of things, and used his scientific knowledge to make deductions about the gods that were consistent with that. And of course, what evidence would be against other traditional beliefs about gods, such as Zeus being all powerful, for example, that would be inconsistent with what we see in the world. So there have been attempts at being scientific with religion, but is that what we actually see? Well, instead, we get a lot of unscientific religion. What does that look like? Where there are nothing but excuses for why the evidence for God isn't there, why we have to explain things away, which is the exact opposite of what science would do. When the evidence is against the hypothesis, you should be diminishing your confidence in it or disbanding it, not making excuses for it. But what has religion been for thousands of years other than excuses for why there's evil or suffering in the world, why prayers don't exist? Heck, why it doesn't even seem like God is present, why we have to explain why he is hidden. There is this entire class of philosophy going in and asking the question, why is it the case that God appears to be hidden? This is a really weird thing if it's obvious God exists, to then have to say, well, here's all the reasons God is hiding. Do we have that sort of belief when it comes to scientific things like atoms? Are electrons hiding? Do they have some sort of reason that we have to be skeptical about their existence because they have some reason to hide themselves from us? That would be weird, right? That would be excuses for a bad hypothesis for why the evidence isn't there.
Oh, I know the
Heck,
reason for this one. I've heard it again on those call-in shows, because it would take away your free will if God revealed himself.
yes. And of course, we also know that's BS on their own mythology because they believe Satan exists. Satan knows gods exist, but doesn't follow God anyways. So they're what, as you can imagine, it's more excuses, it's more apologetics. What is apologetics? It is the defense of a doctrinal position, no matter the evidence. One of the things that William Lane Craig, a famous Christian philosopher, has said that if it were in the contingent case that all the evidence were against the resurrection of Jesus, he would still believe it anyways because of the inner witness of the Holy Spirit. So no matter what the evidence is, he says he's going to believe no matter what. That would never be acceptable in science. If you said that at a science conference, that no matter what evidence I gave you, you would still believe your theory, you would be laughed out and you would be a pariah. And you should be at that point. Because when you have nothing but excuses and apologetics, I have to use the portmanteau invented by Brian Dalton, Mr. Deity. This is excusegetics. And that is unscientific. If that's the only way that you can maintain religious belief, then yeah, there is a conflict between science and religion. If the science were actually being done to show that your religion is true, you wouldn't have to do this. What does the science actually have to say? Can science say anything about the supernatural? Well, I'm definitely suggesting it is. So let me provide some reasons that science indicates that the supernatural is very unlikely to be true. First off, we don't have any confirmed supernatural entities. And earlier I said that the definition for what a supernatural entity is, it's an efficacious, disembodied mind. We have lots of claims about ghosts, angels, spooks, poltergeists, hobgoblins. But how many confirmed cases do we have? Which cases can we scrutinize and see, oh, yep, there was definitely an angel here? Unfortunately, none seem to make the cut. And that should provide evidence about how we're going to evaluate the existence of a disembodied, efficacious mind that we call God. We can actually do math for this. Everyone loves math, right? Well, don't worry, the math tonight is going to be easy. No differential equations this time, though I do have a book for that. I'm going to use something called Laplace's rule of succession. And it's basically you have some number of observations, you see how many successes and how many failures you have, and you use that to say what's the probability that the next observation will be a success or a failure. So you can imagine this in terms of coin flips. If you flip a coin, it could come up heads or tails. If you flip the coin 100 times and it always comes up tails, you have pretty strong evidence to think that the next time it will come up tails, you have a weighted coin. That is the kind of thing that Laplace's rule can do for us. He also tried doing it for things like how we know the sun will rise tomorrow because of all the previous observations. We can apply this then to the question of minds that are disembodied. How many of those there are versus the minds that we have observed that are embodied. So how many minds have we observed in human history? Well, at least all Homo sapiens. So even if we have exclude the other species of Homo or the other humanoids that have existed in world history, if we just ignore them and just stick with Homo sapiens, and we don't even have a chance to say dogs have minds or things like that. So this is a really exclusive set, and we just say humans. That's about 100 billion humans have existed in world history. About 8 billion alive today, and many more who are very much not alive. So how many observations of minds do we have? On the order of 10 to the 11th power. How many supernatural entities have we been able to confirm? Well, 0. So our number of successes is 0. Our number of observations is 100 billion. So our probability under these rather kind conditions, honestly, already show that the probability has to be no better than 1 in 10 to the 11th power, or 10 to the minus 11, which is what we call a really small probability. This is about 1,000 times less than the probability of winning the Mega Millions. So already our prior probability of God, just on the condition of him just being a disembodied mind, is absurdly low because of our background knowledge. And this doesn't even include all the other properties that God is supposed to have, like all the omni properties, all powerful, all good, all knowing, exists outside of space and time. This is even excluding all of those. So this 10 to the minus 11th prior probability is generous to God. So, ouch. And that's just the prior. Let's look at what we might go into the world and see that doesn't exactly match what you'd expect. There's some things from biology and physics that just, in general, don't fit what you would expect. Evolution, as it said, it's red in tooth and claw. That most species are extinct, most species suffer, and very often under predation of other species. We have parasites and parasites out there. We have cancer. We have all sorts of terrible things out there. And religious person might claim, but evolution actually has some sort of goal and it gets us to humanity. So it has some sort of final goal, and this is the beautiful way that God wanted that to happen. The thing is, you could have evolution without Darwin. Under a Lamarckian view of evolution, it's much more directed. Instead, we have natural selection, which is basically you have a whole lot more species or offspring that can survive and reproduce. And so you actually have mass levels of suffering that could have been avoided under a more directed version of evolution. Funny enough, when Darwin came out with his book on the origin of species, very quickly biologists accepted the common ancestry of animals, accepted really quickly as well that humans were related to the apes, but they downplayed natural selection. And there were some good scientific reasons that it had at that time. And they preferred more Lamarckian versions and also thought that was more consistent with Christian theology, that God directing towards, the creation of humans ultimately. But now Lamarckian evolution is discredited. Natural selection is much more the driver. So we've now got an interesting problem where, weirdly enough, young Earth creationists believe in Darwinian evolution, limited, but don't believe in common ancestry. So, that's a weird little historical aside. Nonetheless, we could imagine a different form of evolution that could still get to the same goal without the same level of pain and suffering through history. That is not what you'd expect on a God that is trying to get the greatest amount of good in a timely manner. This sounds like what you'd expect with a bunch of atoms bumping into each other, starving for a little bit of energy.
And
If we look at the
certainly, like in the creationist view, he was able to create a sphere of life. What's the exact word? The plant kingdom, where they just live on sunlight and air, and like they don't kill each other.
yeah.
So yeah, why would animals have to be different? Which is the tooth and claw bit.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. We could have been photosynthetic, but instead the sun gives us skin cancer. Yeah, quite the trade-off. Now, here's one that's going to probably drive you wild. The fine-tuning of the constants of nature. A lot of theists will tell you this is evidence for God. This is probably one of the better arguments they'll have out there to show why God exists. Because if the constants of nature were slightly a bit different, then life couldn't exist in the universe anywhere. And we actually don't know if that's true or not. But weirdly enough, fine tuning is actually evidence for naturalism. Now, why is that? Imagine, could God have created life on Earth even if the constants of nature precluded life developing naturally? Yeah. In fact, that's exactly what Calvin was saying, as I gave the example earlier. The fact that dry land existed was because God actually circumvented the laws of nature to create dry land. So already this is in Christian theology, and it also is expected on supernaturalism. You don't have to have nature able to produce life. Supernatural can overcome that. So the fact that on naturalism, we see the constants of nature consistent with life, that's actually expected on naturalism. There's no way you could observe the universe and have the constants of nature inconsistent with life existing. But on supernaturalism, you could. So strangely enough, if you actually think about it statistically properly, fine-tuning is evidence against supernaturalism. The best argument that theists have out there for their God existing is evidence against it. And I have found that to be a theme very often when it comes to arguments about God. The arguments are either not helpful or actually, when you include all the background information, evidence against their position. Not good for the supernatural, is it? On top of that, if we are supposed to believe that God is somehow communicating with us, well, then how do we explain the massive disagreements about the nature of God or gods? Is there one or many? What is the nature of that God or gods? Massive disagreement and no consensus. You also see that the beliefs about gods are largely culturally determined. If your parents were Christian, you probably are Christian. If you were born in India, you are more likely to have been Hindu. If you were born in Japan, then you probably had some more interesting collection of religious beliefs growing up or having no religious belief at all. In other words, it's not what you'd expect if there was some sort of supernatural entity communicating with each of us, because what we are getting out of it is more what our parents are telling us rather than what our divine father is telling us. And this is really weird if there's supposed to be revelation out there. We don't seem to be getting accurate knowledge about the world. Compare that to scientific knowledge. If I go to India and I go to Canada and I ask a chemistry question, I'm going to get the same sort of answers. Water doesn't have a different composition in Sri Lanka than it does in El Salvador. The scientist doesn't matter. The science is the same in both places. But I go to different places and the revelation is completely different. And those revelations don't comport to the reality as we see it. The God beliefs are better explained by cultural factors or psychological factors. So in particular, there's a lot of study that's gone into the cognitive science of religion, and one of the components is hyperactive agency detection. So we have this tendency to, even in places where there is not an agent, we think there is an agent there, and that seems a lot like God beliefs or supernatural beliefs as well. You hear a stick break in the woods, your first words out of your mouth are, "Who's there?" That's our natural inclination. And we say it's hyperactive is because we are importing the idea that there are agents out there, even when they're not. The whole point of this agency detection is that it has a whole bunch of false positives. And this seems to be an explanatory feature of where religious beliefs come from. That's not what you'd expect if there actually is a God out there and we actually have a way of detecting that God. Instead, we got this device that is just constantly misfiring. Similarly, when it comes to miracles, miracles appear to be so rare that we cannot even successfully detect them. There are lots of miracle claims, but we've never been able to substantiate those claims. If you have millions of claims and never can we show that they're true, it's like you got a bad detector. It's like if you bought a Geiger counter and it's just always going off no matter if you have a radioactive source around there or not. Would you trust the Geiger counter anymore, even if there is a radioactive element? Probably not. Our abilities to actually detect miracles seem to be so poor that even if they do happen, they happen so rarely and so poorly documented that we can't actually determine they have ever happened. And that is very much the opposite of how religions teach us these things are. If God is coming in and curing cancers or what have you, that should have been much more obvious at this point. But instead, when we go and search these things out, either we can't substantiate the claims or we actually find evidence against the miracle claims, such as large scale prayer studies. That is unexpected on supernaturalism, and only excuses push that aside. Fundamentally, if you think you have access to the creator of the universe, why is it that we have so many false claims coming from those religions? So, for example, no, there was not a mass exodus out of Egypt in the late Bronze Age. In fact, I got a new book coming out about that in maybe a few months. We'll see when that finally gets published. But the Exodus story, it is by far and away agreed by biblical archaeologists didn't happen. And yet, for a very long time, everyone claimed this was just straight up history. Doesn't seem to have happened. If you start flipping through the Bible, both Old and New Testament, it predicts the end of the world multiple times. Daniel 9, in its original formulation, was suggesting that the end of the world was going to happen in the 160s BCE. Did that happen? No. Funny enough, Daniel is actually trying to fix a different prophecy from Jeremiah, where he's also talking about the restoration of Israel and the crushing of all the enemies, which didn't happen. So Daniel is trying to fix this prophecy. That prophecy doesn't come true. On the other hand, if you do the same calculations, it seems to be the sorts of things that early Christians were doing to try to predict that the end of the world was coming. So Jesus and Paul both have words in their mouths or in their letters saying that the end of the world was going to happen in their lifetimes. Mark 13 is explicit. This generation shall not pass until all these apocalyptic things happen. Paul talks about saying that he's going to be hopefully alive when the return of Jesus happens. In other words, it was really widely believed by early Christians the end of the world was nigh, and it's about 2,000 years of the end being nigh. Well, we would call that being wrong. And again, it requires excuses to push this away and not expected if we have supernatural insight about what is going to happen. Also, you might have also noticed that these books that describe the structure of the universe are consistent with the cultures that produce those worlds, but not consistent with what we actually know what the world is like. Bible gives us a flat earth with a dome. It tells us that the sun goes around the earth, that the sun and moon are both their own light sources, among many other things that we know are wrong. And again, we have to have excuses for why the Bible looks that way rather than something consistent with how the world actually is. Why do supernatural theories suck? And conversely, then, why does naturalism keep succeeding over and over and over again? When a body of explanations does not succeed in explaining observations, either those explanations are wrong, we require a whole lot more ad hoc things to add it onto that, or there's just something fundamentally unclear or different in how we need to interpret what these predictions even are from the supernatural. Mind you, any of these three things are not good for scientific theories. If it's wrong, well, it should be thrown out. If it requires a lot of ad hoc things, that's not good for a theory either. If you don't know what the theory even suggests, that's also not good for science. In other words, it's kind of natural that the supernatural keeps failing. It's like it's wrong, and to make it not wrong, we have to do a whole bunch of other things that aren't consistent with science. To give an example of what science looked like when it was trying to do those same sorts of things, there's an earlier theory about fire known as phlogiston. This was a theory that when things are burning, it gives off some sort of element in the burning process. So if there's some sort of fiery element in things that is released during combustion. But for it to be consistent with observations, it had to become increasingly ad hoc. So, for example, the idea that when you burn wood, the phlogiston is released, and so the remaining ash should have less mass because the phlogiston is given off. However, they were, as early chemists were realizing, hey, when you try burning metal, its mass increased. Well, how does that work? Well, maybe the phlogiston has negative mass. That's pretty ad hoc, wouldn't you say? And then more and more observations came along, and it just became more and more ad hoc. And eventually, it was just completely abandoned. And instead, it was superseded by something better, in this case, oxygen theory. So maybe supernatural and religious explanations are like phlogiston. It was an attempt to explain things. It has a view of how things are, but to be consistent with observations, it becomes more and more ad hoc to the point we should have just thrown it out. We got so many examples of all these sorts of things that are just wrong. Young Earth creationism, just in general, pretty much everything young Earth creationists say is inconsistent with one or more sciences. Heck, often young Earth creationists have to be even inconsistent with dentistry. Like, for example, when they say that before the flood, everything was a plant eater, then you have to explain, well, why do all these animals have giant fangs or other super sharp teeth to eat watermelons? You have to then deny basic dentistry to be consistent with that sort of view of things. Then, of course, there's the ad hoc things. Satan or God is planting fossils to test our faith. What's the reason to believe that beforehand? Nothing. But now you discover all these fossils. Well, that can't be right. Therefore, ad hoc addition. Of course, also very often we'll just say that, or I should say, we will say, a religious believer could say that we're just misinterpreting what the text is. You're being too literal with what that is saying, which again only happens when you read the text, it doesn't conform with things, and now you have to have it say something else. Fundamentally, over and over again, the supernatural fails, and when you have to come back and just say that you can't test God, you have effectively admitted you can't tell the difference between God existing and God not existing. The two look identical. And that is very much bad for a scientific hypothesis, right? Over and over again, we have to do this rationalization, which means, doesn't that kind of mean the whole thing is irrational if we're the ones constantly trying to rationalize it? Think about it. I mean, if miraculous things happen all the time, we wouldn't have to do all this rationalization stuff and we could read a miracle story and just believe it. The fact that over and over and over again, we see this sort of thing, we don't believe it, and then we have to make excuses for it is the opposite of coming to that belief rationally. If there were good objective lines of evidence that miracles were done by God, we wouldn't need all these complicated philosophical arguments to show that God even exists. Do we need an ontological argument that germs exist, or do we just have a microscope and say, there they are? This is really weird on supernaturalism, exactly what you expect on naturalism. So over and over and over again, the prior probability that supernaturalism was true was already small. And then all these things go completely against it, go exactly with what you expect on naturalism. So I have a slightly modified, upgraded slogan for the buses. So if you remember, there was this bus campaign in the 2000 aughts. in Great Britain put these signs out there on the sides of buses. There's probably no God. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life. My update, but it's probably not very pithy. Science indicates the supernatural very probably is not real. Mind you, I don't say certainty because we can't have that in science, but when you already start with a prior probability of less than 1 in 100 billion and all the evidence is against it, I think we can say, let's try something else. And because we're going to try something else, let's be spiritual in our disbelief. I don't know how many practicing scientists are in the audience right now. And practicing is an interesting term to use here because there are some things that are similar in science and religion, but the thing that I think is the most fascinating is the spiritual growth that happens in the process, where there is both an agony in doing science and an ecstasy that happens in science. And of course, I'm riffing off the title of the book and movie about Michelangelo. If you haven't seen this movie with Charlton Heston and Rex Harrison, I do strongly recommend it. It stands up really well. But fundamentally, where is the power in science? In that it tries to disprove claims. You actually try to go out and prove that you are wrong. And in the process, when you fail to prove you are wrong, that's when you are amazed. When the hypothesis stands up, no matter how hard you push against it, that's when you feel that you've hit bedrock. Science is this, I would say it's a combination of wonder, speculation, and suffering or toiling. There's suffering in all the data collection, all the analysis, all the double checking, all the back and forth, all the debating, all the arguing. But the process itself rewards you with truth the closest you can possibly get to it. And those things we discover, you really do feel the sublime. You feel overwhelmed with what's really there, that you discover really we're all composed of cells, that the molecule of heredity we share with all living species. Discovery is not just sublime, it's human. In fact, I would say it's one of the greatest things a human can have. It's also the sort of thing that God cannot have. If God knows everything, how can he discover? It's so fundamentally amazing that we humans can discover things and be awed by what's out there. And let me just give a few examples of that spirituality really coming in when you go into astronomy. Several years ago, there was a successful picture taken of a black hole. And this picture went viral around the internet of one of the main researchers there, Katie Bowman, who did a whole lot of work in the coding that would take together hundreds of pounds of hard drives of data from all over the world, collected together to produce that first image of a black hole accretion disk. And the awe and the smile that she had just, transfixed the world. It was just shared everywhere because we all felt like she did. Oh my goodness, what are we seeing? All that hard work, and it's finally paid off. And now what do we see? Oh my goodness, this amazing theoretical object where space and time are contorted to such a way that once you go inside, what space and time even are is unknown. And the outer edges are the glowing gas heated up to extreme temperatures, with it being bent around so you can even see behind the black hole because of the warping of space and time itself, all seen millions of light years away, finally coming in to our computer dishes and being assembled together to produce this image, and seeing what is there beyond what our eyes could ever have possibly known. I don't know about you, but every time I think about this image, I remind myself just how amazing that we could even do this, that we could even have a theory that this is something worth even finding, and then doing the science to find it. Astronomy is so full of beautiful pictures. I always love coming back to this one, and this is a recent retake of this photo by the James Webb Space Telescope of what's called the Pillars of Creation, which is a subset of the Eagle Nebula. This nebula is so far away, young Earth creationists say we shouldn't even be able to see it because the light shouldn't have been able to arrive. And what are we seeing? We are seeing the birthplace of stars and planets. Those clouds of dust collapse under gravity, and with enough mass concentrated in one place, form solar systems. As those stars then begin to shine, they create a sort of wind, either through or often through electromagnetic radiation that blows away the gas and dust, and then we see them coming out of their nursery. So some of these holes that you see in these pillars of creation are the stars blowing away the dust to say, I'm here, I'm alive, come find out what's here. This is the sort of place our sun was born in 4 to 5 billion years ago, and is the way many more worlds will be born. And who knows which of those worlds will also have people looking up into the sky and wondering what else is there. Will they be looking at us? Will we ever get a chance to see them? The wonderful possibilities that exist because of the efforts where we first try to disprove our beliefs, and then what remains hits even more amazing than what we believed beforehand. Some quick summary then. There's a lot of things that science doesn't know. Maybe it can never know, or maybe it just doesn't know it yet. However, I would say, based on the history and philosophy that I have covered, the supernatural has not produced anything we should call knowledge. And when it tries to be consistent with science, it has actually made itself incapable of generating knowledge. Supernaturalism has actually failed. The fact that methodological naturalism always works shows that that metaphysical naturalism is very, very, very likely to be true. So I imagine you guys are tired of listening to me. So how about I give you guys some reading recommendations? This is a fair number of the books and articles that I used as background for the talk I have created here. Some of them I directly mentioned, other ones are just kind of in the background. So I don't necessarily agree with all the authors, but they all provide interesting information to make these sorts of determinations. If you want to read stuff by me, well, I would be very happy if you were to look at some of the things that I've published. So earlier was mentioned, I've written The Star of Bethlehem, A Skeptical View, Aliens and Religions Where Two Worlds Collide. This is an interesting one. I actually do solve differential equations to answer theological questions. So another example, can you do math and religion? Yes, I did that. I've also contributed to a few other volumes related to science and religion. One also about the Star of Bethlehem, one here for John Loftus. I also have done some, it's related to counter Muslim apologetics, where they were trying to talk about the Islamic Golden Age. So this book called 1001 Distortions that I added a chapter amongst many other really awesome historians of science. And I've got some stuff coming out in the near future. Currently working through creating a book with my co-author on the Exodus, a critical examination of the Moses story. And in production was mentioned Godzilla and nuclear humanism. So there is one true God, and he lives in Japan.
All right, people, stay for the hangout. We're going to talk about that book.
Yes, and we'll do questions in the hangout too. One of which preview is we're gonna ask Aaron which Godzilla is his favorite and which movie is the best Godzilla movie. So be thinking about that, and we're gonna talk about it in the hangouts. And I was gonna ask also where people can find your work, and I love that you made a slide for us of your work. So I can't wait to read more of those. I did find the Aliens and Religion book on Amazon last week. Is that the best place to find your books, or where should we go to find your books?
Well, yeah. In general, you're going to find the most luck with Amazon, because what does Amazon not own? Elon Musk. That's about it. But one of them is going to buy the other eventually. I could be pretty sure of that.
For sure.
Nonetheless, digital, physical copies of those books are available there. I think you can also find it in some of the other places. I doubt you'd have much luck with local bookstores, but I would sure love to be wrong about an independent bookstore carrying these works. I will also note, so for example, the green book there, The Star of Bethlehem and the Magi, I contribute to that volume. It's from Brill. And if you know about books from Brill, you either buy a book or you pay rent. You can't do both with their volumes.
Yeah. I originally
That's a
thought
tough
to have
choice.
you
Don't tell
on.
me about that.
When I saw that you had that book published, I originally thought to have you on for our pre-Christmas show. Maybe next year we can
Happy
talk
Ooh.
about that subject.
I like this idea. All right. Well, don't forget to check out those books, and I've dropped the links into the chat. So check those out, get you some books, and learn more things. Thank you so much for sharing this with us, Aaron. This was fascinating and very full of information. I'm going to go back and watch this later to probably catch even more of it. That was great. And I'm really excited about your other books too, and to find out more about your thoughts on Godzilla in the Hangout. But we'll wrap up real quick so we can go to that. But again, thank you for joining us. And thank you, everybody else, for joining us tonight or today or whatever time it is where you are. You are the reason that we are still here having the show, because people are still coming to watch and participate in it. So thanks for being here, and can't wait to see y'all next week. Same time, same channel. Hey, Rob, what are we doing next week?
I think we're going to have Sarah Connor. Is that true? Linda
Yeah,
Hamilton. Linda Hamilton, yes, but
yeah,
not that
not
Linda Hamilton.
that one.
Not that one. Yeah. So that the subject is going to be The Fourth Wife, A History of Mormon Polygamy. That's interesting. And upcoming guests after that are Erica Gutta-Gibbon and Objectively Dan. I'm sure most people recognize that name. And for more information about us and to access our other resources, visit our website at recoveringfromreligion.org. So that's something that we'd like you to do, especially if you are thinking of volunteering for us, because we always need more volunteers. There's a tab that you can click, and it'll tell you what's all about volunteering here. And we also want to thank Nikki from across the pond. They run the atheist community of Austin's fan-run Discord server, at least responsible for live streaming this show there to the ACD. And you can go directly there at any time. It's tiny.cc/ACD Discord.
Yeah, and you can also find us on the other social medias. You can view our link tree to see where all you can find us, and I'm dropping that in the chat now. But we are on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Blue Sky, and of course YouTube, where you may be watching us tonight. So check us out there. There's a ton of previous episodes of RfRx on YouTube, as well as lots of other content on our other sites. And if you like and subscribe and follow us on those, you will not only get to know what all is going on with us and see what upcoming shows and content are coming out, but it also helps other people find us who may need to recover from religion and benefit from our services. So please like and subscribe if that is something that you are able to do safely. We appreciate it. And like I said, don't forget to check out the other playlist on our YouTube channel. And what else can people find on there, Rob?
Yeah, so we ran long tonight. So in the interest of brevity, I'm just going to say you can go to our main website and find a whole bunch of things. We have a video there, 3 minutes long, called RFR What We Do, and you'll learn about everything that this organization does. And as I mentioned, we always need people to volunteer. You can click the volunteer tab if you're so inclined, and it'll tell you what that's involved.
Awesome. And as we mentioned earlier, if you are joining us tonight live and you want to continue the conversation and find out more about Aaron's thoughts on Godzilla, as well as the rest of the conversation topics that we went over this evening, you should join us in the Hangout, which happens right after the show in Zoom. And I have dropped the link to that in the chat, and we'll be going over there as soon as we wrap up. But before we do, I want to welcome our fabulous executive director, Gail, to wrap us up with some closing thoughts. Gail, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kara. Dr. Adair, what an incredible presentation. This was fascinating. Those of us, not everybody's journey is the same, but those of us who grew up in fundamentalist religion, when we made that deconstruction, that separation from religion, the face of that research scientist as she sees the black hole, a lot of us have experienced that in a relative sense when we discovered science, because we had just been kept from science, or what science we were exposed to was dumbed down, watered down, and especially if you were one of those folks who discovered it as an adult and you have this incredible appreciation for science and the depth of it and the beauty of it and how it all works together. So we're like school children sitting and listening to you. There was a far higher incidence of the mention of neutrinos than I was expecting, but that was awesome. That was a wonderful presentation. And we thank you so much for being with us. And I hope you'll consider coming back. Everyone else, thank you for joining. As everyone has already mentioned, I hope you'll join us in the Hangout. It's a little less formal. It's an opportunity for you to unmute your microphones and be able to have a little bit of interaction with our guests tonight and our hosts as well. So thank you for attending, and we'll see you all next week.
Thanks, Gail. Thanks, everybody. And with that, that's your RfRx for this week. And remember, consult your inner skeptic before taking advice from anyone claiming absolute truth. And we'll see you next week. Bye.